Welcome to our channel. I'm Jim from RV4x40.com.
And I'm Chris.
We'd like to welcome you today and hope you'll enjoy this video. We've done a series on our trip to Alaska, and we thought we'd wrap it up with some personal comments about that trip and give you some details that perhaps would answer some questions that have come up. These are things people have asked us about. The first question we get is, why did you want to go to Alaska? And I can kick that off because I've thought about driving the Alaska Highway ever since I heard about it as a kid. The highway was built as part of the World War II, part of the defense project, and it was built by the U.S. up through Canada into Alaska to connect the lower 48 with the territory. At the time, Canada gave the right-of-way, the land to build the highway. The U.S. paid for the construction of the highway, and largely U.S. contractors and some Canadian contractors were involved. But the highway started off as 1,700 miles of highway from Dawson Creek in British Columbia to Delta Junction in Alaska. That's the official Alaska Highway, or the Alcan as it was known in those early days. It was open to private traffic in 1948 after the war, and at that point the road was really a rather rough way to get there. It had been built as a military highway, and they were not particularly concerned about creature comforts. But over the years the highway has been straightened and relocated, and so now instead of 1,700 miles, it's actually only about 1,300 miles long, which is still a pretty long highway. Ironically, locations along the highway are still referred to by their original mileposts, so you can't actually use an odometer to get to some things if you follow the milepost guidebook, which is the kind of the Bible of how to tour to Alaska. It will give you locations based upon the original milepost as if it were unchanged, so that gets to be perhaps confusing at some time, but we encourage anyone who's going to actually drive it to get the milepost. It's really an essential resource for driving up and making this trip.
We thoroughly enjoyed that drive. It was so beautiful going through Canada and up to Alaska, and much to see, many historic sites, and just beautiful scenery, beautiful camping spots, and so we thoroughly enjoyed that drive.
Yes, actually, I would say that some of the scenery in Canada was every bit as spectacular as the scenery you see eventually in Alaska. It's a lot closer, so perhaps that might be something you want to think about. We took the Icefields Parkway up through the eastern slope of the Canadian Rockies to Banff and Lake Louise, and that part of the trip was absolutely gorgeous. Spectacular mountain views, snow-capped peaks, and some scenery that you wouldn't get any other way. So it would be something, if you're considering a shorter trip, you might want to think about that. But we did enjoy the trip to Alaska.
And Lake Louise was just beautiful, crystal clear, turquoise bluish water, and a beautiful, beautiful place to be and relax. We had lunch looking out over the lake in the old hotel, old and beautiful hotel that's there, and it's a very popular vacation site for folks. Well, we wanted to enjoy that drive up through Canada and into Alaska, so we opted not to take a cruise, which I'm sure would have also been just wonderful. We had traveled around the United States, so we were pretty comfortable with our traveling in the RV. We sleep in our own bed every night, and it's the best way for us to go, and we thoroughly enjoyed that trip.
Yes, if you wanted to take a cruise, you certainly would be able to get there in a more relaxed and faster way to take the cruise up. And some folks will take a cruise up and spend time in Alaska and then take the cruise back. Other folks will actually fly back. So there's some options to do that. You might want to consider that. One of the questions that we get asked sometimes is, why do we do it ourselves and kind of as loners, as opposed to joining a planned tour from a number of companies that will offer tours to Alaska up and back with guides and pre-planned stops and those kinds of things. And actually looked at some tour brochures and places and found out what they stopped and what they did, along with other research, and using the guideposts we planned out our own route. We ended up stopping a lot of times in a campground that would have one or more tours going through them. It was interesting, but we were certainly glad we made the trip when we did and didn't wait for going with a formal tour.
Well, my favorite part of the trip was the wildlife that we saw. It was always exciting, and oftentimes along the highway you'd see RVs and cars stopped on the side where there was room, and bears crossing the road, or different wildlife, a moose, or whatever we might be seeing, and it was always special. So that was really my favorite part of the trip.
Well, I certainly enjoyed the wildlife, and we've got pictures we've shown in other videos that show you some of the things that we saw. But on top of that, as a photographer and trying to take the landscape photographs, it was just spectacular scenery about every place you looked. We had waterfalls, we had wildlife, as Chris talked about. We had spectacular mountain scenes, snow covered. We actually saw some snow in August as we were coming down from Alaska, and covered the road, got it white. It was nothing particularly bad to drive in, but we did see snow on the ground while we were there locally, as opposed to being on the glaciers. One of the highlights that I liked particularly was I took a helicopter tour, which landed on a glacier, so we got to see the glacier without having to climb up there to get to it. Chris elected not to take that particular ride, but I was fortunate, since I was solo and there were other people on the helicopter with us, but I was sitting in the left-hand seat, the pilot was in the right-hand seat, so I had a spectacular view out the bubble of the front, and it was really an awesome sight to fly up this mountain valley with the glacier below us and eventually land on it. It was a couple hundred feet thick where we landed. It's hard to imagine being on a pile of ice that thick, but there was actually a stream flowing down through it, which was the beginning of the river that flows out of that particular glacier. So every place we looked, there were spectacular sights. If I had to pick one site out of all of it, it would be Mount Denali, or Denali, just I guess the way the word is pronounced. Used to be Mount McKinley, but been renamed to the native name of Denali, which means the big one, and it is a humongously big thing. You can see it from probably 150 miles away or more on a clear day, and we saw it from that far away, and then we also saw it reasonably up close within about 25 or 30 miles of the mountain itself. So that was a spectacular sight, and probably the single most outstanding sight of anything we saw along the way. One of the places we visited was Valdez, which is probably best known because of the Exxon tanker spill there a number of years ago, which was a major disaster in terms of ecological impact. But prior to that, in 1964, there was a earthquake out in the Gulf of Alaska, which resulted in a tsunami. And the tsunami was something like 28 feet tall when it hit Valdez, which is up a fjord off of the Gulf. And it pretty well wiped out the town. There were 28, I believe, deaths in the town that time. That may not be the accurate number, but a large number of people were killed because the town had been built down on the shore, which was basically sand and rock and dirt. And that soil actually liquefied from the earthquake and then the resulting tidal wave that came up. And so it washed away major portions of the town. Interestingly enough, they didn't rebuild it where it was originally, but a local man had owned a fairly large plot of land near where the town had been based that was on solid rock. So they relocated the town over to this rock base, so it's in a much more stable situation now. But there was one town not far from Valdez at about 1/3 of the population, a population of about 68 people, and roughly 1/3 of that town's population was wiped out in that earthquake. So it wasn't the biggest death toll, but it was, in terms of percentage of population, it was phenomenal. There were places near Anchorage where the ground lifted, I think, 25 or 30 feet, and other places it dropped about 8 feet. So there was a total change in the elevation of the landscape of about 40 feet, which is phenomenal when you think the energy that it took to do that. So there's a museum there, very interesting to go through and watch and get some of the information about what happened to that town. One of the questions that we get asked is about how far ahead do we have to plan for campgrounds and that kind of thing. And in general, we only plan maybe a day ahead about the next stop we were going to make, and tried to find a campground in that particular town, that particular location. A lot of times it was the first campground we would contact, we would be able to get into. Other times I may have to check out one or two to get a campground with a spot for the duration we wanted to be there. So we didn't plan very far ahead in terms of that. The one time that kind of got us into a little bit of trouble was when we were going to Denali. And that was one I just had not anticipated the number of people that would be there, and this was in July, so it's probably the height of their tourist season, and there were people there from everywhere. We in fact saw one RV that had Australia license plates on it, so they'd shipped the RV over from Australia to put it there. We also saw one in a different spot from Switzerland. So people bring their RVs from around the world to tour Alaska. But in that case, we couldn't get there, so we actually drove through Denali Village on the way down and went on down to the Kenai Peninsula and spent some time down there, and had made a reservation to come back to Denali. So then we came back and spent about a week in a campground there.
So many of our campgrounds were right on the water, on the bays or the rivers that we were near, and it was really enjoyable to be surrounded by such beautiful scenery. And also, of course, many of the places that we stayed were mountain views, and we saw wildlife in our campground at times too. So it was very special, and just finding the campgrounds as we go worked well for us.
The roads in Alaska, and to Alaska for that matter, are often under construction during the summer. Their construction season is very short, so they have to concentrate the effort when they do it. And one of the things people worry about is damage to the vehicle. We were driving a 40-foot motorhome and towing a Jeep behind it, and we really didn't suffer any damage of consequence. There was one piece of trim on the Jeep that got broken along the running board, but the RV itself didn't get any particular damage. We did have several dings in the windshield by the time we got through, which I really expected given the roads and the trucks that travel by and all this kind of stuff. But we already had a cracked windshield, which was going to need to be replaced, so I wasn't too worried about that. So we didn't take care of that until we got back. We did have one situation where the Jeep developed a slow leak, and we didn't have a spare tire for the RV with us. If we had to replace a tire, it was going to be an effort probably to get a replacement tire, but we were going to do that. The Jeep, of course, did carry a spare, which we didn't use. But it did develop a slow leak. It would check the tires every day before we would move anyway, and found out this one tire was leaking a little bit, so I'd pump it back up and it would hold, but it was obviously had picked up a nail or something. And so it was a little bit of time to find a tire shop that would do it, and found a guy with a small repair shop and made arrangements for him to pull the tire off. And we pulled the tire off, found the nail stuck in it, pulled the nail out, plugged the tire, and after that there were no more problems. So that was the most serious mechanical difficulty we had on the entire trip.
One of the interesting things that happened was we were driving along on a rainy day, and the windshield wiper on my side, fortunately, just fell off. And so we did travel for a while without that until we were able to find another windshield wiper to replace that. And I believe it was the motor that was part of the problem.
Well, no, and it was ironic because it was not raining hard, so the windshield wipers were on intermittent. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw the right-hand windshield wiper just disappear. It just dropped out of sight. I really expected to see it come out from behind the motorhome, so I was watching in the rearview mirror to see what happened, and it never showed up. So we drove down the road a little bit further and found a spot to pull off, and when I did and got out in front of the coach, it was held on by the rubber tubing that goes to the squirter on the windshield wiper. So I was able to pull it off, and the base of it had actually cracked. So we actually went without a windshield wiper until we got back to the States. We were, I think, in Idaho before I was able to get one, found it online and had it shipped to us. So we went for quite a ways with only the driver's side windshield wiper. But it was the one that was the most critical. It was still working.
Unfortunately, we did not have a lot of rain once we got through that initial day. And so it worked pretty well.
One of the more interesting things that happened to us was coming out of Skagway. And when you travel from Skagway, you've gone through Canada to get, if you do it by road, which is what we ended up doing. There's another video about that whole episode. But in any case, we came through Canada down into Skagway, so you have to go back through Canada to get back into the U.S., but to get back into Canada again on the return trip. And we left from Skagway to come back down to the lower 48. So we got to the Canadian border, and it was nothing particularly unusual, except we're from Texas. We have Texas plates on the coach. And the Mounties, or whatever they call their border patrol people there, the police anyway, asked us a couple of times if I had any firearms on board, and I said no, I did not. And I didn't declare anything else because knowing we were going through Canada, and I did not want to have to deal with trying to get an import license to take firearms into Canada and go through that hassle, I just elected to take them out before we left Texas on this trip. So we're up there, and the police, as is their right, decided to search the motorhome, I think in large part because of the Texas license plate. So they get us out. The dogs hadn't been out in a little bit, so Chris took the dogs across the road, and I went into the Mountie station to talk to them and let them into the coach to search it.
Well, they ended up leaving me across the road with the dogs. They did not want Jim and I together. So I was across the road in a grassy area with the dogs for probably about an hour and a half. And during that time, Jim was in the office and being questioned. And one of the gal there, the officer, began the search of the RV and was, as we could tell later, very thorough in her search, and unfortunately did find some things.
Well, what she found was a box of .22 ammunition, and I had taken the firearms and I thought all of the ammunition out, so I hadn't told them about that being there. Neither had I told them about a range bag which I had left in the motorhome, or a couple of holsters that were there. So she found the ammunition and found the holsters, and then decided that I had to be maybe secreting firearms somewhere. So she spent a lot of time going through all the drawers, everything she could find. There were no firearms in the coach, so they didn't find anything, but they spent a lot of time looking for it. And in the meantime, I was talking to the other officer in the building, and he was clearly trying to engage me in conversation specifically about firearms and what I shot and what my experience was and how he liked firearms and all this kind of stuff. So I think he was just trying to get me to spill something. There was nothing to spill, so we didn't do it. Eventually, they decided there was nothing to find and came back in. And then they cautioned us about not declaring the fact that there was ammunition and some other firearm-related paraphernalia in the motorhome. I started to say, well, you didn't ask about that, but decided to keep my smart mouth somewhat under control and said, okay, officer, I will remember that. And we had to go from Canada then down back into the U.S., which was fine, no issues there. And then we would go to cross back into Canada at the British Columbia border later on. So when we got there, and there was another officer, happened to be a lady, was the officer there, and she asked about things, and I said there were no firearms on board, but I volunteered that there was ammunition and some other range paraphernalia on board. And so she then proceeded to query me as about why I had that if I didn't have firearms, and why was I traveling with that without having any firearms on board. And I explained to her that we're full-time in the motorhome, and we removed what we thought would be a problem from the coach before we came to Canada to respect their laws, and that we just didn't think it was necessary to do this. But previously an officer had told me I should disclose all of this to the next person who asked. So that was our experience getting back into the U.S. through Canada. Turned out to be not anything particular except for the couple of hour delay while they did their job. So no harm, no foul, and all of that. One of our other experiences, which at the time wasn't very pleasant, and there actually is a whole video that covers a lot of this, but we'd planned on taking the ferry from Haines up to Skagway. It's about a 16-mile ferry ride, takes an hour or so, and due to a whole bunch of circumstances which we won't go into here, we were unable to take the ferry, ended up spending the night boondocked on just a wide place in the road outside of where the ferry is located, and then ended up having to drive about 290 miles instead of taking a 16-mile ferry ride. So that was probably the most exasperating thing that we had at the time. And it wasn't that it was particularly a bad drive, except we started off late at night because of the timing of the ferry and not being able to get on it, and the fact that we needed to get to Skagway because I had a shipment from the States that was being sent to the post office for general delivery in Skagway that I really had to go into Skagway to pick it up. Otherwise we might have skipped Skagway altogether.
It turned out that that camping spot that night was beautiful, right on the water, and that was the great part about that problem.
Another interesting thing that happened, and I've talked about the road construction. We were going somewhere, I'm not sure exactly where now, but driving down a road, and it wasn't particularly well marked, and I didn't see it in time, but we dropped off of a cut in the road that at the time seemed like it must have been 3 feet. I'm not sure what it was. It may have been just a few inches, but the entire motorhome was dropping. I was probably doing 40, 45 miles an hour at that point, and it was a very severe jolt. And at the time, nothing seemed to be damaged or anything, so we didn't stop. But when we stopped that evening and went back and checked in the closet, there's two closets in the rear of the coach, and they're at the far rear end, so they saw the most jostling, if you will, from that drop. And I think every single hanger in those two closets was off, and the clothes were just in a jumble, a heap on the bottom of the closet.
So yeah, there were some bad roads, and some were just washboards kind of roads, and others, like Jim says, had some pretty. That one in particular had a pretty big drop for us. We also crossed one area that was particularly muddy, and this was up near Chicken, and it was pretty interesting. Jim thought he was going to get stuck, but he drove it on through. And but for the most part, the roads were fine, not a big deal, and of course it's well worth it to travel.
Right, that particular road out of Chicken, they were rebuilding the road. It was a dirt road, and they dug out a lot of whatever had been there to put in new base and rebuild the road and pave it all the way into Chicken. So it was wet, it was muddy. There were several RVs had gone out before us that particular day, and so they were sliding around. And it's interesting, this rig weighs, the motorhome weighs 33,000 pounds, and there's about a 5,000 pound Jeep behind it, so we're 38,000 pounds total weight. And when something like that is sliding on a slippery mud surface, and you have absolutely no control where it slides to except where the rut in the road is, it becomes interesting. But we were able to keep the motorhome moving through all that. I was able to confirm with an RV that stopped at our roadside park a little bit later on that the road out of Chicken had been shut down for 45 minutes or so because an RV had gotten stuck and they had to deal with that. But we'd made it through okay. It really didn't affect our trip to Alaska in the long run. It was just a bit of a harrowing experience at that one point. We hope you've enjoyed this video about our recollections of our trip to Alaska. We hope it'll give you some information and maybe some help for someone else. It's something we thoroughly enjoyed and encourage everyone to take the trip if they have the opportunity. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. That does help us out. And if you'd like to be notified when we post a new video, click on the bell icon. You'll get an email notification from YouTube when that happens. In the meantime, we hope you'll join us on the highways and byways of America as we travel around. Perhaps we'll meet up at some point. And remember, keep her between the ditches as you drive.